Today I'm going to be talking about unlicensed cultivation, as it said in the program, but I'll be focusing in on work that I've been doing with Dr. Margiana Peteresen-Rockney, who will be following me, and Dr. Christy Getz over here at Esplum at UC Berkeley. So cannabis bans in California are quite common. Only a third of the counties in the state actually allow cannabis cultivation to proceed. Yet nearly 3/4 of localities in California actually voted for legalization, including 2/3 of counties, right? Nationally, 13 of the 16 legalized states that have fully functional systems by now, they allow local level bans. And most localities in most of the states, the majority of localities actually institute those bans for the majority of their localities. So if the US accounts for 85% of the legal global market, then local bans may be the most pervasive legalization policy, quite ironically, right? So we set out 2 years ago to understand the cannabis cultivation ban. We had two simple questions, which was what causes ban policies and what effects do bans have? We had more kind of intricate questions at a sub-level about, do bans work? When, where, and why do they work? And what do they work at? When do they fail and why? And are there better and worse ways of governing through bans? And that's what I want to get at today. So to answer this, we did a comparative study of 4 different counties of Napa, Yuba, San Bernardino, and Siskiyou counties. We did interviews from the spring of 2022 until the fall of 2023 with over 100 people, probably closer to 150, including officials, cultivators, residents, and others. So what do cannabis bans do? Just adjust my screen a little. Okay. So first of all, on the surface of what they portend to do, cannabis bans seek to expel or to banish an activity. They make the statement, not here, not in this community. They also envision a world in which government policy can absolutely stop an activity. They are aiming for cessation, stopping, halting. There's an imaginary of a kind of strong government here, exercising total control over whether an activity will occur or not. There's shadows in this of prohibition logics, of the ability kind of under the drug war to be able to stop drug activity simply by saying no. But distinct from prohibition, there's cannabis is decriminalized in California. In fact, legalized. So it now doesn't depend on criminal bans, but these are civil bans done under the capacity of local governments, namely their control over land use, where, when, and how something will happen, and with bans, whether or not they're allowed to happen at all. So that's the surface, but in actuality, bans are not quite the absence of regulation. They're regulation by enforcement and punishment. Unlike regulation, though, they can only say what not to do, not what to do. In that way, it's a form of indirect regulation by force. For local populations, they adapt and they build informal norms. The best they can hope for, state and the government, is to influence behavior by causing adaptations and instituting informal norms, meaning they try to get people to control themselves through signals they make through enforcement and punishment. And a lot of times this can actually reproduce prohibition dynamics on the surface level, just simply through the imposition of a big no from the government. But at worst, they actually can often reinstitute prohibitive dynamics like racialized policing, which Margiana will talk about, exceptional punishment, and social marginalization. So getting into the case studies, I want to start with Napa County, which on the face of it is a ban that seemed to have worked. Between 2020 and 2023, there are virtually no documented outdoor unlicensed cultivation cases. And this wasn't really because the county had some amazing totalizing enforcement system to detect and eradicate all cannabis. Quite to the contrary. What we found through fieldwork in Napa County, in the absence of those kinds of law enforcement first approaches, was that they really diffused a lot of the need for unlicensed cannabis cultivation simply by making personal cultivation accessible and allowable in the county. This increased access for a lot of people. So people that wanted to have some plants didn't have to break the law. And there was a pathway to legal cultivation, a means of normalizing things. They also integrated cannabis into local land use policies and treated it really as a civil matter, whereas responded to by planning and zoning officials rather than law enforcement first. And it was really a neighbor-to-neighbor kind of issue. And this really led to the normalization, I think, of cannabis in the county, even if not at commercial level, certainly at the personal level. So another factor that we found in Napa County was that it's quite expensive there. Land is quite expensive, labor is quite expensive. An average property is almost $1 million. It's expensive to grow cannabis on private land, therefore, and also labor is just hard to support because housing is scarce and the cost of living is quite high. And in addition, on public lands, a lot of it had been affected by recent fires in 2017 and 2020. And also the penalties for growing on public land generally are higher. So people are, in what I've been noting across the state, people moving on to private land and out of public lands generally. So the seeming success story of cultivation bans didn't seem at the end to have a lot to do with bans at all. But in fact, cultivation stopped not because of bans, but other economic, ecological, and policy factors. So in Yuba, we noticed a little bit of a different pattern of governance, where since 2020, since COVID began, they have let up on enforcement and begun to operate in a little bit of a different way. They've instituted waiting periods before they will find somebody or do an abatement, go and cut people's plants. They'll allow you time to kind of abate problems by yourself. And they treat it like any other kind of restricted land use. If you're in violation, they give you a notice, you have kind of a civil time to be able to work it out. So in that sense, it was treated like other kinds of land uses. And what this cultivated among people, cultivators, farmers, was that that they were able to establish a bit of more social norms around how to grow cannabis. People reported to us informal modifications to their growing behavior based on interactions that they had with officials, and also signals that they were kind of indirectly being sent through kind of enforcement actions. So people stayed under size limit. People avoided water diversions. People didn't grow near the property lines where their neighbors would get pissed at them. And because those were the people that were consistently busted. So really, we saw like an informal system of rules emerging between enforcement and growers themselves. In contrast, we did work in Siskiyou and San Bernardino. And there's a lot of differences between these counties, but I think there's some striking similarities. One is that they had an infeasible personal cultivation ordinance, meaning that essentially anyone who grew cannabis was bound to be breaking local rules, and they were subject to enforcement. Also, land was cheap, meaning that people were more likely to be able to make a living. They were seeking out these places in order to be able to grow, especially in current market conditions where profit margins are quite slim. So unlike Yuba in the last couple of years, Siskiyou and San Bernardino took a very punitive approach with very intensive sheriff-led campaigns that brought lots of legal consequences as well as major financial penalties for growers and landowners. And they employed marginalizing discourses in the process that painted all growers with a broad brush as lawbreakers and worse, sometimes even enemies, with comparisons to Mogadishu and other places, which subsequently produced an us versus them dynamic within communities. These are very divided places. Cultivators are very vilified. So this resulted in San Bernardino in lots of adaptive cultivation techniques. People moved into more remote places. They tried to hide in new, innovative ways. They were growing in intensive short cycles that often meant more extractive relationship to their environments. And they persisted in cultivation despite enforcement, which I think suggests that there was really, and this is kind of the reports we heard from most cultivators, there's really an economic motive around why people continue to persist in cultivating, that the cheap land might suggest. And also in San Bernardino in particular, the proximity to consumers was important. And these were mostly people, farmers, that had few other formal market options. These were people that couldn't leave the cannabis industry. And I think particularly in this period of 2022, 2023, at the bottom of kind of like the price drop, folks who were left were really struggling, I think, to make a profit at all. And most people who could got out. And that is consistent with a report we'll be putting out this month on another project I'm working on. In Siskiyou, Cultivation subsided in less enforced areas because of falling prices in their remote geographies that made it really hard to access markets. But in more enforced areas where enforcement was much more intense, specifically among ethnically Hmong people, cultivation in communities adapted. People organized for their self-protection against police, and they had to establish kind of a parallel system of governance to provide for themselves what the government wasn't able to do because of their vilification and sometimes very direct criminalization of people living in those areas. So as far as recommendations, can bans be done better, because there's clearly some worse and some better results here. And I think if we were to take any lessons from this, the first would be that there needs to be a feasible path to personal cultivation, if not a regulatory program altogether. Second would be that there needs to be tolerant approaches to cannabis as a land use, to really normalize cannabis and integrate it into existing land use systems. Third would be education and redirection. So when people are in violation, to be able to educate them on what else to do. We commonly heard this from cultivators as something they wished was available, to really have a pedagogical approach to regulation, even to bans. And to have reasonable financial consequences, because we can, if people are motivated by economics, then we could say, well, go after people with financial consequences. But it might address that economic logic, but I think it do behoove us to remember who is actually kind of left in the unlicensed cultivation system. And these aren't, despite all the discussion of cartels and organized crime and whatever we might imagine that to be, most of these are marginalized, low-income, ethnically marked, racially marked peoples who are trying to figure out how to make a living. So there's a lot of shortcomings to be spoken of, but I'll just focus on one with bans, is that really at the end of the day, the only kinds of regulation, if you're not going to be able to stop cannabis cultivation, is to be able to regulate it, but the best bans can do is to regulate it very indirectly. This is really governance by signal for better and worse. So the question remains, what kinds of signals are we actually sending?